Not since the abdication crisis in 1936 has there been so much debate about the direction of the British monarchy. In these modern times, when so much is written about so little, one factor remains constant: the dignity of the Queen, who celebrates her 70th birthday today. The Queen is the most famous woman in the world. She's ruled over this country for over 40 years, and as head of the Commonwealth, she's recognized by a quarter of the world's population. In this short tribute, we look briefly at some of her achievements and enjoy an insight into a few of her qualities through the eyes of those who have met her.
She is a warm and compassionate human being. She's been a great monarch, a great leader, and I respect her in so many ways.
And believe me, when she smiles, you'd climb Everest for her. I would anyway. And I'm old and short in the leg.
I always feel that whenever I go anywhere and she is there, everything stops when she comes into the room.
I would be quite happy to approach Her Majesty and say, "This is your life." I mean, I don't know how long I would survive before I was struck down, but it would be worth a try.
Elizabeth Alexandra Mary of York was born in London on this day 70 years ago, the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York. She was nicknamed Lilibet, and together with her younger sister, Margaret Rose, enjoyed an idyllic and private childhood. In 1936, her grandfather, George V, died. Her uncle David succeeded to the throne as Edward VIII, only to abdicate a few months later for the love of American divorcee Wallis Simpson. This not only thrust her unwilling parents onto the world stage, it was to change her destiny. She was only 14 when war broke out, and throughout those dark years, the whole royal family sustained the nation's morale. The war took a heavy toll on her parents, particularly her father. But through the post-war gloom of 1947 emerged a new and bright light, the wedding of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip of Greece.
Somehow it was a sort of Cinderella story, that we'd all been in rags, and suddenly here the whole nation was in riches, and the crowds with the flags out and the cheering, and everybody was, you know, so excited and thrilled, and it was just euphoric, the whole thing.
The birth of Prince Charles in 1948 was the start of the new royal family that was to be as close and as united as the princesses had been. But by this time, King George VI was gravely ill.
And I remember it was in Africa, at the treetops in Kenya, where she first heard that her father had died and that she was the new queen. I mean, it was the talking point of everybody, you know, everywhere in the country at that particular time.
As the aeroplane was landing, she looked out of the window and didn't see her own car, saw the line of those big black royal limousines, and said, "Oh, they've sent the hearses." And suddenly it struck one that this young woman of 25, that from now on it was going to be a public life for the rest of her life.
I remember on the coronation day it was, and she was leaning out of this lovely coach, and she looked so beautiful, and this lovely smile of hers. Very happy day, very happy lady, young girl.
We had to get into Westminster Abbey very early, and of course watching other people arrive was always interesting. It was a magnificent occasion, and I remember that from breakfast to lunch was really quite a long time. One couldn't help noticing that some peers down below had made provision for this and were quietly restoring their strength.
I just watched it in a friend's house, and we watched it on his 6-inch black and white television set with the rest of the nation, and saw the newspaper headlines about Everest being conquered. All this and Everest too, it said. It was a wonderfully exciting time.
10 years later, during the swinging 60s, the optimistic mood of the country was marked by honours for the Beatles and football fever.
I played in an FA Cup final in 1963 at Wembley. And I think it was one of the last cup finals that the Queen actually went to.
And behind, I think, Bobby Charlton.
And I said to her, I said, I hope you enjoy the game, ma'am, you know. And she said, but you aren't half sweating, which I thought was really strange, you know. I thought she would say perspiring, not sweating.
Racing to beat the whistle, Geoff Hurst saw an opening in the defence and achieved a hat-trick.
I met her after that when we went up to collect the World Cup in 1966.
In 1969, Prince Charles celebrated his 21st birthday, and the Queen created him Prince of Wales. 3 years later, the Queen and Prince Philip celebrated their silver wedding. On this occasion, she reminded us of her dry and exacting sense of humour by recalling a well-known catchphrase.
I think everybody really will concede that on this, of all days, I should begin my speech with the words, my husband and I.
The Queen is both head of state and head of the Commonwealth, and her early reign had not been without constitutional problems. The self-styled independence of Rhodesia in 1965, and the argument over the use of sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa caused huge strains within the Commonwealth and threatened to break it apart.
We certainly sometimes felt during that time that the Commonwealth was lined up against us in an unfair way. That's all over now. And the fact that that's all over must be a huge relief to the Queen. But being head of the Commonwealth gives her a role. And it's not just a formal role either. It's something that she and Prince Philip feel very strongly about and give a lot of time to. And I think it's abundantly worthwhile, particularly if, as I believe, Commonwealth is coming out of the shadows of the 70s and 80s and re-establishing itself with an actual role in the world.
I have had the opportunity of meeting with Her Majesty, and I have found her to be very well informed about world events and also considerate and compassionate. And I think Her Majesty has a wonderful way with words of putting things across in a manner that is dignified and understated.
In 1977, the Queen celebrated her Silver Jubilee, the 25th anniversary of her succession to the throne. It was a time of social stress and economic anxiety.
The Queen, and indeed the government of the day, took a bit of persuading that the country, and indeed the Commonwealth, was ready for a year of celebrations. It was a rather cautious start, but as the Queen went to all the Commonwealth monarchies and to every part of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, and as the thousands and thousands of people turned out, and as the children rushed up and gave her Mars bars and flowers, and the whole thing went on and on and on, you could see her constantly being surprised at the affection and indeed the love that there was for her.
I don't think she was expecting that, but I don't think any of us were expecting that, except my father. I think that he, you know, had seen so many occasions in the past like that where suddenly, you know, everybody rallies round and discovers what a wonderful thing they have that they've been taking for granted and carping at. And suddenly they realize, no, but this really, really means a lot and has a great significance for us all.
Just before 11 on a balmy June morning in 1981, confidence in the Queen's security was profoundly shaken. Blanks were fired at her from the crowd on her way to her birthday parade, the ceremony of trooping the colour.
I would imagine she was more concerned with the animals than herself, because, I mean, I think that's the way that, you know, she would feel. I think it sort of brought to reality something we'd never believed in this country would happen. But I don't think that it's ever sort of made her take extra precautions against security for herself.
But on holiday in Scotland, things were still relaxed. In particular, one family outing to the Highland Games of Braemar in 1982.
This particular day I put too much resin on my hands, which you have to put on your hands so the wood itself doesn't slip. And I actually won the Queen's trophy at that particular time for the overall champion. And it was going to be presented immediately by the Queen. And I said, look, I've got to wash the resin off my hands because it's too sticky. Now, they said, now. So I said, right, fair enough. So I went up and was receiving the trophy, and Her Majesty stuck her hands out, and I got her hands, and she actually stuck to my hand, and I was like so embarrassed, you know, and I like put the trophy and pull her hands off, you know. That actually kind of sent everybody up in uproar with laughter, and somebody took that particular photograph, which I've got a copy of, you know, and it won Photograph of the Year.
In 1983, Britain went to war in the South Atlantic. The Queen's second son had joined the task force.
Queen and the Duke of York were so anxious that the Duke of York should go there and fight for his country, for the freedom of the Falklands, as many other sons of mothers. And she had all, therefore, the same anxieties as every mother, but she insisted that should be so. Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it human? Isn't it conscientious? Isn't it personal duty of a very high order?
The Queen is now the longest-serving head of state in the world, and during her reign she's seen 10 British Prime Ministers. On a special evening in 1985, the Queen and Prince Philip went to number 10 Downing Street.
It was the 250th anniversary of number 10, I think, and the Queen and Prince Philip came. The other Prime Ministers were invited. This was a very pleasant, informal evening. There was no great protocol about it. And they wanted a photograph of us, so we just stood round. And it's perfectly true that Alec was rather covered at one end, and so we moved along. But that was very characteristic of her. She always noticed those sort of things, took action to put them right.
Most recently, the Queen has been a tireless ambassador for her country, putting into practice her philosophy of building bridges to as many people as possible.
The Queen came to Washington for a state visit in May of 1991. The ceremony, the greeting ceremony, took place on the lawn behind the White House. President Bush, who is maybe 6'2", came up to the podium and said his words of welcome, and then he stepped aside and the Queen stepped to the podium. And of course, the podium was much too high for her, and all the photographs in the newspapers the next morning showed the top of the podium and this hat and these little queenly eyes in between. And I think people were struck by the joke of it. But the next day, the Queen went to address a joint session of Congress. This is a big deal. The two houses of Congress meet in the chamber of the House of Representatives. Everybody's around. It's a big event. And again, there she was, standing in the well of the House of Representatives, and her first line to these politicians was delivered absolutely straight.
I do hope you can see me today from where you are.
And then all these politicians who understand this stuff extremely well just broke into uproarious laughter, and she had that house in the palm of her hands. But I wish everyone could see her up close and personal, as Barbara and I have seen her. The respect that almost everyone feels for her would be even higher. And if anyone doubted that, I would love to have them see and been on the field when the Queen went with me to this baseball game in Baltimore. It was a working man's crowd, blue-collar workers, if you want to call them that. The place went absolutely wild in showing their support and their friendship for Queen Elizabeth. It was a wonderful thing.
But 1992 the year in which the Queen was supposed to be celebrating 40 years of her succession to the throne, the royal family were under intense pressure from inside and out. The marriages of both the Prince of Wales and the Duke of York had collapsed. There were increasing calls for the Queen to pay income tax. And what seemed like the last straw, her home at Windsor caught fire, and St. George's Hall, one of the great banqueting halls of the English state, was reduced to a smouldering shell. Fighting against a heavy cold and clearly shaken by recent events, the Queen delivered an unusually frank statement.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
I was writing to her private secretary, Robert Fellows. I just said how sad it was that what ought to have been an annus mirabilis had turned out to be an annus horribilis. I'd forgotten, of course, my Latin grammar, because the right word for a horrible year, the right translation for horrible year in Latin is annus horrendus, I think.
Last summer, the Queen, together with her mother and sister, appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace as they had 50 years ago with Winston Churchill and King George VI to commemorate the 50th anniversary of victory in Europe.
She was absolutely astounded at the crowd, the amount of people that came. And it thrilled her so much. You know, she wasn't putting on an act. She was generally surprised and very, very happy. And I thought, well, that's nice, because I think she was probably a little worried that maybe the crowd wouldn't be quite what it was. And it just showed the affection that everybody had for them.
I took my daughter because I wanted her to feel part of a nation. And this was the moment for her. And indeed it was for me, because there we were, crowds and crowds of us, listening to Dame Vera singing. And Rachel and I were right next door to a group of Cockneys who'd been here during the war and had been there first time. On the first VE Day. It was a very important moment in our nation's history that was recreated, because again, the bond of monarchy was restated.
As a 1940 baby, I don't remember the war. All my memories are secondhand. They're all from movies or what other people have told me or I've heard people say. And when the fly past came over the palace, I have to say that I cried with the rest of them. Having sung in front of the palace with Dame Vera and Sir Harry Seacombe, we were then invited backstage, so to speak. And right behind that balcony is a big room, and behind that room is a corridor, and in the corridor we waited until they came out, having been on the balcony waving to all the people. And I've never seen the Queen, the Princess Margaret, or the Queen Mother so animated. I mean, they were absolutely overjoyed. The Queen Mother said something about, oh, well, did you enjoy singing the songs? I said, I did, but did you enjoy them? Because you know them better than I do. She said, oh, I know them very well. And the Queen leant over and said, yes, and we've been rehearsing all week.
She never misses anything. You can be absolutely sure that she would have picked up every little detail. One event that brought this home to me in VJ Day, and there was a march down Pall Mall and all the veterans, and I was one of the Burma Stars who took part in the march. It was wonderful, marching past the stand with the Queen, and I happened to talk to the Queen on the telephone later that day or the next day, and it was terribly hot, it was about 90 degrees, and she knows that I have some trouble sometimes with my feet, and she said to me, I do hope that your feet were all right on that long hot march. And I said, well,
Thank you very much. Yes, they were fine. I said, well, being you, you probably noticed that I had very sensible flat shoes. Yes, I did, she said.
The Queen has never lost sight of her sense of duty and continues to perform a punishing round of engagements. She honors over 2,000 people every year, an occasion which the recipients will never forget.
On this occasion, we all came into a long hall, many people following each other, and one of the pages would say, OBE, and you'd say, no, knighthood, knighthood, in there, please. And then the next person come and said, OBE, no, MBE, NBE, down those stairs and on the left. So we were segregated. There were no sheepdogs, but there were pages.
But the Duke of Edinburgh wasn't very good at pinning this thing onto the shoulder. And the Queen came forward and said, no, 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 not like that. And like a, you know, a good mother, she pinned it up in the correct place and then stepped back. I thought she was very, very competent.
It's a lovely feeling, really. And as they stepped forward, they had the minstrel gallery, the band were playing, and the pianist slipped in, if I rule the world, just a few bars of that. It made me feel quite at home.
Her Majesty puts a sword on one shoulder and then lifts it extraordinarily high to put it down on the other. I felt that there must have been an accident prior to that in which she thought, in a moment of absent-mindedness, you could go from one shoulder to the other directly without making any provision for the head.
Privately, the Queen is a country lady at heart. She's well known for her love of animals, and she's an accomplished horsewoman and racehorse breeder.
Flat racing is known as the sport of kings. Well, of course, as the sport of kings and queens with her, it is inestimable. Any other activity, any other sport would do anything to get as a patron, which virtually Her Majesty the Queen is.
The racing manager, Lord Carnarvon, was a bit frightened of, you know, perhaps not being English, so he came to the weigh room beforehand and he said to me, now Frankie, you know you're ready for the Queen today, you know what to do. And he said you have to go to the paddock, you have to touch your hat, you know, you have to call Your Majesty, and then you have to call a mum after that.
The Queen goes to extraordinary lengths when naming her horses, looking at the sire and dam and the names of them. One I particularly liked was Enharmonic, one of her favourites, and the dam of Enharmonic was called Contralto. And actually gave one of the great joys of Her Majesty in 1993, Enharmonic in a thrilling finish to the Diomed Stakes at Epsom on Derby Day. Got up and won by a head. It was a 12-to-1 chance, and it went by a head, Enharmonic, in a difficult horse to train. And the sheer joy and the excitement and the thrill that Her Majesty got from Enharmonic's win just proves her love of the turf.
And I walked to the paddock, and there she was, the Queen, and I just froze and I went, how are you? Just like that. I wanted to dig a hole and drop myself in it, and looking out was kicking me in the leg, you know. But by then I did the mistake, and like, she looked at me and she laughed and she said, well, I'm still here.
Just before Easter, the Queen visited Norwich Cathedral for a ceremony that dates back to her earliest ancestors, the distribution of the Royal Maundy.
I just said, thank you, Your Majesty. Delighted I was.
Well, I noticed when she went to an elderly lady on my right, as she gave her the coin, she just gave her a little squeeze of the hand, and I think that said it to me, that I'm, you know, you're my people, sort of thing.
Well, I think she's always about among the people. I think that's one of the main things. And she always gets a great welcome out of it where she goes, even here in Norwich, seemed like it.
Her Majesty the Queen carries the history of this country on her shoulders. She represents us all in so many ways and on so many different occasions, most recently following the terrible tragedy at Dunblane. She continues to occupy a unique position in our lives, due almost entirely to her total devotion to duty, a concept and a role that she has indicated she will never give up.